We love improperly. And here's another aspect of Platonic thought that Augustine finds particularly helpful. For Platonists, evil is not a thing. And that means that evil is not a substance. Evil is not a person, or a force, or a power that seeks to overcome the good, as it does in Manichaeanism. But evil is simply the word that we have for the corruption of good. It's how we describe what happens to a soul that is corrupted. Hold on one second, I'll find a good passage for that. He explains this really thoroughly in Book 7, Chapter 12. And he explains how God creates only good, and therefore God could not have created an evil substance, an evil thing. So God creates good things that can become corrupted because they're imperfect. But things that God creates don't become entirely corrupted because then they would no longer exist. There would no longer be that good that reflects the goodness of God, and therefore those things would no longer exist. So he summarizes, he concludes that evil is not a thing, it's not a substance that God would have created, because that's impossible, but is the term that we use for the corruption of a good. It's the word that we use to describe how our souls become corrupted and disordered. So evil is not a substance. It describes the privation or removal or corruption of good. So, wins out over Manichaeanism for Augustine. It nicely explains both kinds of disorder. Our souls are disordered because we love improperly. There is evil in the world because, again, we love improperly. But evil is not a thing, it's not a power that can take us over. It is the corruption of good. So God remains good. And he also finds that Platonic thought is more in line with the Christian teaching that's in the back of his head about the goodness of God and the goodness of creation, including the goodness of the material body, about how we go astray and are led into sin. The two combine well. So what Augustine constructs really is a Platonic Christianity. Now I want to say one last thing about his journey. Well, I've talked about his journey from Manichaeanism to Platonism especially. Platonism changes his mind. It helps him to understand better. It changes his intellect and his belief. But it doesn't change his nature. And Augustine is convinced that our nature, our good nature, as creations of God, has been deeply corrupted. This is the idea of original sin that I talked about at the beginning. Through the corrupt will of Adam and Eve, when they desired to eat the fruit that God said they could not eat, through their corrupt will, all human willing has become corrupt. That is, we can no longer desire or will the good by ourselves. So Platonism changes his mind, but it doesn't change his nature. He still has this, is living with, as are we all, according to Augustine, this corrupted nature, this pride that leads him to seek to satisfy himself. That's his chief concern. And so what changes his nature is not what he learns from Platonism, but what he receives through Christ. And I'll point to one last passage, Book 7, chapter 18, where he talks about the humility of Christ. That humility is God becoming human. God humbling God's self to the extent that God takes on a human body. That is the ultimate humility. And that is both an example for us to follow. We follow Christ in that humility, particularly through ascetic practice. But more than an example, God in Jesus Christ cures us of our pride. It says this in Book 7, chapter 18. Christ changes our nature so that it is once again good, no longer corrupted by pride. And so the lesson there, again in Book 7, chapter 18, is that Christ cures human pride, and that the imitation of Christ, following Christ's example, enables one to learn and to practice humility itself. And especially, again, the humility of ascetic practice. Notice in Book 9 that we're told that shortly after he is converted, he and his friend Alypius become monks together. In order to live a Christian life, one must be ascetic. One must discipline the body and the soul in order to take on that humility of Christ. Okay, I guess we're about out of time. Does anyone have any questions? No questions?